And I have sent around a handout. And the most important thing for the handout is that it has the headings, so you can see where in the talk we are as we're progressing. And then for those who are interested, there's also a glossary, which I'm not going to review, obviously, but to the extent that a question comes up about a term that I'm using, the definition is right there. And I will begin with a prayer of St. Thomas, designed so that I use your time well. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Grant me the grace, O merciful God, to desire ardently all that is pleasing to you, to examine it prudently, to acknowledge it truthfully, and to accomplish it perfectly, for the praise and glory of your name, you who live forever and ever, amen. So let us begin with the introduction. Freedom, law, and happiness are hot topics in any age. Who doesn't want freedom and happiness? Who doesn't have a view on what the law should be? To many, to be free is to be unhindered by an external restraint. Law is an external restraint. Freedom and law are thus often viewed as inversely related. The more law, the less freedom, and vice versa. Happiness and freedom are usually understood to be directly related. The more freedom, the more happiness, and presumably the less law. Although that view may have contemporary currency, that is not the understanding of freedom, law, and human happiness in the Catholic tradition. The subject of my talk is that Catholic understanding. I will be speaking today mostly within the domain of natural reason, though my discussion of ultimate and perfect happiness will refer to divine beatitude, and thus will enter the domain of faith and grace. I begin with a spoiler. Happiness is the key to our story. It is the final cause and the North Star of our understanding of freedom and law. Happiness is what we all seek. But here's the issue. Does happiness flow from the universal and objective good? Or is happiness found in our own subjective preferences that we say constitute the good? The answer to that question will determine our understanding of freedom and law. Let us begin with an overview of our topic and the foundation on which our study will be based. The foundation of freedom, law, and happiness, teleology, and essentialism. The words ordered to are the touchstone of my presentation. Our world is teleological. That is, things have forms or essences that are designed to achieve ends or final causes. To accept the teleology of the created order, that things have forms and finality, might be called teleological essentialism, or essentialism for short. The word essentialism refers to essences or natures. Our human nature is that which makes us human and distinguishes us from other kinds of things, such as cats and dogs. The essence of a tree is its treeness. Essences or natures are ordered to and perfected by ends. Reality is thus intelligible, as each thing is marked by a nature, perfected by an end, and situated as a part within a comprehensive and coherent whole. Essentialism is central to the Catholic tradition, especially as reflected in the work of St. Thomas Aquinas and the classical and patristic scholars upon whom he relied. Nominalism. Many in our contemporary world deny that things have an essence or form, and that things have a proper end or finality. They believe that things just are, and await man to give them meaning, if any meaning can be given to things. Man is such a thing. According to the contemporary view, we become only what we make of ourselves. In that way, man declares himself sovereign over his meaning, goodness, and happiness. The core of that worldview is that things lack form and finality. Things are simply singular and are not ordered to or perfected by any end. Reality is atomistic. Members of a species do not share a common nature, but only similar characteristics. I will refer to that worldview as nominalism, because it holds that the words nature and essence are only names that we give to groups of things with similar traits. Freedom, law, and happiness. Freedom, law, and happiness are understood very differently by an essentialist and a nominalist. For the nominalist, freedom is fulfilled in the act of choosing, and the goodness of freedom is defined by the one who chooses. Law is a command that should protect the individual's freedom to choose according to his preferences. For the nominalist, happiness and the good from which it flows are specified differently by each person. Law should be indifferent to the substantive content of happiness and the good that each person defines. For the essentialist, freedom is fulfilled in the thing chosen, and the good of freedom is the condition attained by having chosen well. Objects of choice are good to the extent that they lead us to our proper end. For the essentialist, law is an ordinance of reason that leads us to the objective good. Happiness flows from the objective good and is the condition in which all desire is sated. The highest form of happiness in this life, even if imperfect, is found in seeking in thought and deed the universal good, who is God, who alone can fully satisfy. Revelation teaches that complete and perfect happiness can be found only with grace in the next life, in union with God in beatitude. We thus see that the topic that we are about to explore is founded upon one's understanding of reality. Is reality intelligible and teleological with form and finality? Or is it atomistic, consisting only of singulars, with no intrinsic order, natures, or essences? To argue about freedom, law, and happiness without first establishing our relationship and understanding of reality is to place the cart well before the horse. Let us now discuss freedom, law, and human happiness in their own right, and along the way we will contrast the view of the essentialist or the Thomist with the view of the nominalist. Freedom is ordered to the good. Freedom as a capacity and a condition. Freedom sells, as the saying goes. Everyone cheers for freedom. We are the land of the free. But what is freedom? For both the essentialist and the nominalist, freedom is a capacity and a condition. Freedom is the capacity to choose this or that, as we do from a menu and countless other times every day. Freedom is also the condition in which those choices are possible. For the essentialist, freedom, more specifically, is the condition in which our intellect sees the true and the good. Our will is not enslaved by addiction, and we are truly able to choose easily and well. For the nominalist, freedom is the condition in which external restraints on his range of choices are minimized. Free will as an instrumental and teleological capacity. In the Thomistic tradition, our capacity to choose, our free will, flows from our rational nature. Reason allows us to deliberate and then to act or not act. By that capacity to choose, free will gives us dominion over our actions and places us in the image of God. The essentialist recognizes that every free act is for an end, so that human action itself is teleological. We do not, however, choose our end, at least not our ultimate end. Rather, our end is given to us, just as our nature is given to us. As St. Augustine said, God made us for himself, and we are restless until we rest in God. Free will allows us to select a means to our given end. In exercising free will, we compare imperfect and competing means. We then choose the means that we judge will lead us to goodness and happiness. Free will is thus an instrumental capacity that is ordered to our fulfillment and happiness, and that we can exercise for or against that end. The drama of life for the essentialist is in distinguishing authentic from counterfeit goods. His free will is fulfilled in the goodness of the object that he chooses, and is frustrated by the defects in the chosen object. For the nominalist, however, choice is fulfilled in the act of choosing, not in the object chosen. The nominalist denies that he has either a given nature or a given end. Indeed, any such nature or end would be an external restraint on his range of choices. Rather, the nominalist declares sovereignty over his choices and the good that he seeks. For the essentialist, the good is independent of his subjective preferences. It is objective and real. Let us now explore what that objective good is. The good to which freedom is ordered. The good as perfected and the fullness of being. For the essentialist, the good has two properties. It is desirable and it is perfected. The good is desirable because it perfects and completes us. Goodness, therefore, gives us a fullness of being. We've come to the primary point that distinguishes the essentialist from the nominalist. When the essentialist says that the good that he seeks is objective and real, he really means real. For the essentialist, the good is mind independent. It is in the thing to be chosen and is not defined by our tastes and preferences. The essentialist thus seeks the good that will realize his potential and that will give him the real being that he ought to have. Choosing the good thereby moves the essentialist toward the fullness of his being. That fullness is both material and non-material. It is physical, moral, spiritual, and psychological. Returning to form and finality, a thing progresses toward its fullness of being as he fulfills its form and attains it at its end. A mature tree with large leaves and a rounded crown has a fullness of being, or an ontological goodness, because it has fulfilled its nature as a tree that suffers from drought or has been damaged by a windstorm does not have that fullness of being. The ontological notion of goodness, real being and its fullness, would be unintelligible without form and finality, without natures and essences that are proportioned to ends, to the fullness of being the things ought to have according to their natures and essences. The good as subjective preference. For the nominalist, who's rejected form, finality, and teleology, goodness cannot reside in the thing. It cannot be objective, real, authentic, counterfeit, or perfected by an end with the fullness of being. Goodness must be a preference that resides in the mind. Each person seeks the goodness that he defines in his singularity and sovereignty. For the essentialist, man adds to or detracts from his ontological goodness by the moral actions that he undertakes over a lifetime. To the extent that our free choices perfect our nature, they're morally good. They thereby enhance our being, physically, morally, spiritually, and psychologically. Let us now turn to the interplay among freedom, goodness, and law. Law is an extrinsic principle that directs our actions to the objective good, the essence and kinds of law. Law is often understood only as a written rule that is enacted by a political community. A nominalist typically understands law that way. But for the essentialist, law is an analogous term. A law is any rational ordinance that is directed to the common good, made by one with care of the community and promulgated. The essentialist recognizes several kinds of law: eternal, natural, human, and divine. Each kind is law in the fullest sense of the definition just given. For the essentialist, each kind of law crucially leads man into the light of the universal and common good and out of the darkness of self-preference. The nominalist thinks of freedom and law as inversely related. The more law, the less freedom. The best use of law is to protect man's freedom of choice so that each person can flourish according to his own specification of the good. In the world of form and finality, law is an aid to freedom by directing man to his proper end and goodness. St. Thomas thus says, quote, "The proper effect of law is to lead its subjects to their proper virtue. And since virtue is that which makes its subject good, the proper effect of law is to make its subjects good," end quote. To briefly review the four kinds of law, we find human law in our statute books, common law and established customs and tradition. Natural law is man's rational participation in God's eternal law. Natural law directs man by the light of divine wisdom as imprinted on human reason to do good and avoid evil. Eternal law is the rationality by which God governs the universe. Form and finality mark the teleological structure that God's eternal law imparts to reality. Man's apprehension of the good, which is burdened by error in this life, is aided by God's revelation. That revelation is known as divine law. Although divine law operates in the realm of faith and grace, it aligns with the natural order and assists and elevates man's reason. The relationship among the kinds of law. The relationship between God's law and human law is vertical and derivative. Eternal law is at the top and is the source of natural law. Divine law stands alongside eternal law and teaches man through revelation about supernatural things and aids his wounded reason. Natural law, as part of eternal law, cannot command or approve what is contrary to eternal or divine law, or the form and finality of created reality. Human law, our positive law, is derived from and is governed by natural law. Human law specifies and implements the more general precepts of natural law, to lead a given society in its historical and changeable context to the universal good. If human law treats the good as self-defined and ignores form and finality, human law may become untethered from the natural law and may even contravene natural law. Were human law to do so, it would no longer be an ordinance of reason and would therefore lose the character of law. Human law that violates a primary precept of natural law, such as thou shalt not kill, thus becomes a nullity. It cannot command obedience, and it cannot provide the basis for judgment by one purporting to render justice. Natural law, as the source from which human law is derived, should serve as an interpretive norm of human law to avoid a conflict between natural and human law. If, however, such a conflict cannot be avoided, then natural law must act as a negative norm that precludes judgment from being rendered pursuant to the corrupted human law. Natural, eternal, and divinely revealed law would be rejected by the nominalist. For the nominalist, the world has no natures and ends, no form and finality. Law is what man says it is. Law is not subject to any higher or universal norm, because no such norm exists. For the essentialist, eternal, natural, and divine law lead us into the light of the objective, real, and universal good. We will now see that such a good has an additional characteristic that Thomas calls common. The common good to which law directs our actions. The common good as superior to the individual good. St. Thomas is emphatic that the good to which all law is ordered is the common good, not a private or individual good. He is similarly emphatic in his discussion of justice. Thomas identifies the highest form of justice as general justice, which directs all virtues to the common good. Simply put, we are ordered by our nature to living well in community. We are parts of a whole, which recognizes man's special place within successively more noble communities. Both a common good and an individual good have a fullness of being. But as we discussed last fall in this Law and Context series, the common good is more perfected and is ontologically higher than the individual good. A common good is one in number and perfects all who participate in it and operates on a higher plane than do individual goods. The common good of the political community consists in civic friendship founded on a collective life of virtue. That common good brings a fullness of being to the community itself and perfects those who participate in it. St. Thomas summarizes the relationship between the individual and the community with this pithy statement, quote, "The part loves the good of the whole as becomes a part, not to refer the good of the whole to itself, but rather to refer itself to the good of the whole." For the nominalist, the law is ordered not to the common good, but to a vast variety of individual goods that each person defines as his own flourishing. If the nominalist invokes the common good, he means those conditions in which individuals can pursue their own conceptions of the good life. The nominalist thus turns Thomas's statement on its head. The part loves the whole only to refer the good of the whole to itself, not itself to the good of the whole. The common good is community, not proximity. The primacy of the common good, according to the essentialist, has been illustrated well by one Brother Augustine Buckner. Brother Augustine is a student brother at the Dominican House of Studies just across the street. He shared this instructive anecdote in the online journal Dominicano. Quote, "It was my first year singing in the Dominican Schola, and I was learning the intricate beauty of polyphony. A more seasoned brother leaned over and let me know that I'd really internalized the tempo. Great, I thought. I'm getting the hang of this. My face must have betrayed self-confidence. Since he went on to explain that wasn't a good thing. His advice was simple. You need a metronome. By internalizing the tempo, I had stopped paying attention to the movement of the choir. I was internally consistent, singing the right notes all in good time, but I had fallen off the piece as a whole." Brother Augustine continues. Polyphony is an elaborate form of singing in which the singers must move and breathe together. The quality of each singer is not measured by his own sound, but on how he blends with others. Each singer must be drawn out of his own timing into a common tempo. The resulting glorious sound is possible only through the proper ordering of complementing pieces. If a part tries to dominate, the piece will fall apart. A choir's perfection arises from this small community's commitment to its common good, end quote. Law should serve as a collective metronome so that our individual activities are harmonized to form a civic polyphony, not cacophony. That harmony provides the common good with its proper fullness of being. Brother Augustine next connects the common good to a shared sense of reality and morality. He rejects the internalization of tempos by adjacent soloists. Quote, "If we're to have a common good, we need a basis for that good, a shared sense of reality, which is increasingly disappearing. The result is what you'd expect. If we view our communities as the mutual safeguarding of individuals, freely moving in and out of relationships, we do not have community, but proximity. Instead of the intricate layering of a polyphonic whole, it is a group of soloists singing near each other. If we want to live polyphonically, if we're going to live in a true community, we need a common tempo. We need a moral metronome." Brother Augustine concludes, quote, "The result of our sweet solos is alienation. If our moral metronome is to draw us out of ourselves, it must come from without. That extrinsic moral metronome is law in all its analogical forms. Law is the extrinsic principle that leads us spiritually, morally, and materially to the good of the whole. Therein lies human happiness." Our next and last topic. The happiness to which freedom and law are ordered. Happiness for the essentialist is the satisfaction of all human desires. No more seeking, full attainment of our end. The essentialist realizes that only the universal and common good, not any particular material good, can fully satisfy. That follows from the essentialist understanding of the will and the intellect. St. Thomas teaches, quote, "The object of the will is the universal good. The object of the intellect is the universal truth. Nothing can lull man's will save the universal good. That is to be found not in any creature, but in God alone, end quote. Thomas continues, quote, rectitude of will is necessary for happiness because rectitude of will consists in being duly ordered to the last end, end quote. That end is the universal good, God himself. For St. Thomas, as well as the ancient philosophers, the universal good can be attained at least partly and imperfectly in the natural order by seeking God in every thought and deed. Christian revelation teaches that the ultimate good can be perfectly attained only in the next life through union with God and beatitude. Whether we restrict our consideration to natural reason or we progress to the higher order of grace and revelation, the reality of a universal, objective, and common good is the cornerstone of a correct understanding of freedom, law, and human happiness. From that good flows happiness in both its natural and imperfect form and its supernatural and perfect form. For the nominalist, the universal good and the universal true are unintelligible concepts, as no universals exist, only singulars. The particular goods in which the nominalist seeks happiness are the subjective wants and desires that he expresses through his singular and sovereign act of choosing. For the nominalist, law must protect that domain of sovereignty. Conclusion. We thus see that the relationship among freedom, law, and happiness depends on whether reality is intelligible, teleological, and marked by form and finality. As Brother Augustine observed, community requires harmony, not just proximity. And harmony requires a shared understanding of reality. That understanding will yield a shared apprehension of the universal, objective, and common good to which freedom and law must be ordered. Given that evidence of form and finality abounds in our amazing universe, I remain hopeful that we can achieve that consensus, even if nominalism may predominate in our contemporary culture. The challenge is to direct the debate on freedom, law, and happiness to the fundamentals of goodness and reality and away from the rhetoric of autonomy and self-sovereignty. Thank you. Okay, so any questions or comments? Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the distinction, if there is one, between the things as having a nature which are ordered to an end versus things being an end in and of themselves?
Yes, so the nature is the essence or the form of the thing. So the treeness is the essence or the nature of the tree. And its end is to have the fullness of being that that entity can have. And nature has a dynamic note to it. So that when you have a human nature as a newborn infant, you have within yourself the potency to grow to an adult male. And growing to an adult male, fully physically, morally, and psychologically, is your end. And your nature is full of act and potency, which then becomes realized as you approach the fullness of your being. So the end is that which lies at the end, or which draws you to it, so that when you become united with that end, you become fulfilled and participate in its goodness, which would be similar to the community. When you become integrated into the community and participate in the community of civic friendship, you then reach an end, which is extrinsic to yourself, but you become fulfilled in that end. That help.
When you say something is an end in and of itself, what do you,
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe I
that
missed
that
on
has
that.
resonances with like Immanuel Kant's philosophy. But
Well,
I'm wondering like if you have a specific definition in mind, maybe.
well, yeah, that is where I started actually. But where I ended up thinking was with the Genesis account wherein God creates, to continue the example, a tree and sees that it is good. So
Which
that-
it is,
so
insofar as it exists.
so that causes me to think that there is an intrinsic. I don't want to say endness to it, but there is some sort of intrinsic good to the tree as it was created by God. Whereas like the end as it is being used here in the discussion regarding
Yeah.
essentialism seems very much as an extrinsic sort of
And which one becomes fulfilled in that end. So there are two kinds of ends. There are intrinsic ends and there are extrinsic ends. And the intrinsic ends, not surprisingly, exist within the thing and represent the fullness of the being within itself. And the extrinsic end is that to which the thing is called to perfect it. So if you want to go to Washington, DC, you're here, but if you want to go to New York, New York would be an extrinsic end, and you want to go to New York and get what you're looking for in New York. And that would, for this purpose, that would be an extrinsic end. But it is a little tricky because means and ends can become one another. That is, you seek an education for the intrinsic goodness of knowledge, but you also seek knowledge to know God better. So that an education is an intermediate end that is partly intrinsically good and partly instrumentally good. Something like money, dollars, can only be an instrumental good used toward another good from which some intrinsic goodness may be obtained.
okay. Would you, so last quick
That's
thing.
okay.
You used a particular phrase earlier where you described an end as being more fully, and unfortunately,
Well, a greater, you mean, an end, a common good end or a particular good end? Is that where you were going? You were just trying to understand?
like, there was this language about like more fully being perfection.
Yes.
And I'm just trying to like write down the actual like words you used.
Well, no, I said that a good has two properties, it's desirable and it's perfected. It's perfected insofar as it brings the thing to a fullness of its being.
Fullness of, thank you, that's it, that was the
And
question.
the point is that we can have a natural fullness of our being, in part intrinsically, and in part through contemplating higher things, universal truths, and reality outside of ourselves. And by that contemplation, we get an even greater fullness of being. And the perfect fullness of being is to be in communion with God. But note the communion aspect. It's never a solipsistic fullness. It's a fullness that flows from commonality and community. Other thoughts or comments? I may have a question for you guys. So what does all of this talk about freedom, teleology, and the good and happiness have to do with law school? why would I even think that a presentation like this has a place in a law school? Yes,
Well, something that I've been thinking about more recently than I have previously is just kind of the pervasive nature of positivism within the law, and how that's essentially how the system we have is run. And in particular, we had a long discussion about this in our civil procedure class about the Erie Doctrine, and kind of the foundations of the modern positivistic movement within the law.
no, I mean, just for some here may not be lawyers, so what do you mean, explain what you mean by the Erie Doctrine?
Yeah, so essentially, the Erie Doctrine states that when there is a case being heard by a federal court, they have to use the law of the state that would ordinarily have jurisdiction over the case. Now, previous to that, there was sort of the idea of general law or common law, kind of an appeal to the natural law. And these federal courts had, in cases where there wasn't a statutory law governing it, they could, make an appeal to this general common natural law in order to aid in their decision making. However, after the Erie decision, they said, no, you have to look to the law of the state. Specifically the common law of the state as well as statutory law, which sort of eliminated the idea that the common law is common or general or natural in any way, and emphasizes sort of the man-made nature of it and gets rid of this discovery.
And the limited jurisdiction of, limited subject matter jurisdiction of a given legal precept. It's a Delaware proposition of common law.
Yes,
It's not a universal proposition of common law.
correct.
Yeah.
And so I think that to me has been sort of the relevance. And what I've been trying to think about is how to, and you kind of brought this up at the end, is how to kind of combat this, the pervasiveness of positivism, of radical individualism, and I don't know, that to me seems like the reason you bring it up in a law school context is that we kind of exist in a system that's contrary to the ideally functioning natural law system where law is a guide toward the ultimate good.
Yes, and the most important point from a law school perspective is we deal for 3 years and in pretty intensive study in the application of legal principles to facts. And we talk about what courts should and shouldn't do. But we don't often step back and say, should law be understood only as what the legislature enacts? Is there any universal norm to which what the legislature enacts is its subject? Well, it's the Constitution. Well, what are the guiding criteria by which the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution? Well, it's going to be history. Maybe, history or deeply rooted traditions within our nation. But all of it comes back to the contingencies of our historical founding and growth as a nation. And what happens if you've actually got wrongly designed traditions and customs and human views? Is there any basis on which to say that law does not command obedience? And if we don't have an analogical understanding of law, we are going to be limited to a positivist view. If we do have an analogical understanding of law, then we really should explore it and know it. Know what we mean by the natural law as a set of universal and non-contingent primary precepts that guide what is good and what is evil. Obviously, the first precept is to do good and avoid evil, but how do we bring that down to the next level of human action? And the Decalogue is the most obvious example. But that is an extrinsic moral metronome. And we certainly don't have a consensus on it. We don't even have a consensus, I think, that innocent life should never be taken. Because we say that if we're sovereign, we can decide that our own innocent life should be taken through assisted suicide. Or we can say, some say, that the life inside of me can be taken for one or another contingent reasons. So that first precept is missing, and we have no real matrix according to which to assess our abortion-friendly legal culture or our increasingly friendly medical assisted suicide culture. So it's really important, as we are, if we're can be considered experts in the law, one would think that we would have a pretty good understanding of what we mean by law. And then how we square our assessments of that law as right, wrong, good, or bad.
How would you go about combating that? Because that's something that I've frequently encountered in conversations with lawyers, judges, classmates, where I sort of have this idea, this more classical idea of law, as a guide toward the good. But we're essentially speaking two different languages because of how just pervasive this positivist view is. How would you go about, I guess, turning the tides on that so we can start to have that conversation and move away from, whether it's the pro-abortion position or the physician-assisted suicide position? How do we move our culture away from that, and how can we even begin to have that conversation?
So the answer to your question sort of varies depending on whom you're speaking with. If it's a judge, you can, it would be a fool's errand today to invoke the natural law. Unless perhaps it's the Supreme Court, and then it would have to be couched carefully, but it wouldn't be inadmissible at that point. But to any lower court, it would be a fool's errand. You would probably try the idea this is embedded in the traditions of our country, and that from at the time of our founding, there were just moral precepts that were widely accepted and that are embedded in our constitutional protections. And I think a pretty good argument can be spun out that way because natural law was more prevalently used and accepted and used in courts at the time of our founding. So you could make a historical argument. It's not an argument that would be based on the ontological reality of natural law. It would be rather a sort of a contingent argument. So it's not a top level argument, but it might progress you down the right road. Now, if you're speaking to another person, just another peer, then it's a wide open conversation. And the question really is, what do we understand as law? And if it's an ordinance of reason, which ordinance means this is what you should be doing, and it's ordered to an end that is objectively good, and it comes from outside the human mind. It resides in the human mind, but its source is outside. It's the objective moral order. Unless you get that element of reality established, you will be talking by each other.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, did you have a thought? No. Okay. Interestingly, this idea of the common good met its match with the likes of Thomas Hobbes. And I say that because Thomas Hobbes introduces the concept of the state of nature, in which there is no morality, there is no justice. It's a state of war, man against man, brute, short, vicious. And that basically says that man by nature is not meant to live in community and is not fulfilled in community. Man is fulfilled singularly and through the likes of whatever material gain he can capture and bring to himself. And although that caricature of man, because there is no human nature at that point, we're all just individual beings fighting for our survival and to collect as much of what we like as we can. From that view of man came a great skepticism that the good is in fact objective and common. And then we get people like John Rawls who will say, we don't want a comprehensive worldview in society. And the best we can do is to respect each other's equal dignity and give them their silo within which they can define their own good. So we really don't have any conceptual understanding of a common good. We have only adjacent soloists and laws meant to protect the zone of privacy, not to direct one to an objective good.
I think that that's a fundamental flaw with the way we discuss the natural law itself. Rather than, you know, just because our society is like sinful and morally evil or what have you. I think that at this point, you know, whether you want to make an argument like from, you know, some kind of twisted evolutionary psychology perspective, or from like a very Christian fallen nature of man perspective, there are significant reasons to doubt human reason's ability to apprehend a transcendental natural law. And the like, I think that if we are to establish that sort of like common language, we actually need to appeal to something higher than the natural law to get anywhere in the first place. We have to establish first the validity of eternal law, of like the actual metaphysics, before we can even begin to discuss, you know, the utility of using human reason at all to guide morality.
But isn't that form and finality? The metaphysics of the eternal law, isn't that the order that's in the universe? That we have natures that are ordered to the fullness of being, that give us the signposts of moral action.
I'm not sure, I haven't gone that far yet.
If you clear cut a forest for no reason because you think it's going to make you, you know, give you a thrill, then you just decimated one of nature's great resources for no good reason. Or if you decide to pollute streams with abandon as a byproduct for your manufacturing process and don't take on board the cost that comes from your own actions, that's a moral deficiency. Because you're desecrating a very, you know, a beautiful human God creation, and you're not absorbing any of the responsibility for that.
Well, that's well and good, but that argument's not going to carry much favor with people who don't believe that morality exists at all in the first place.
But that's why I close by saying that the evidence of form and finality abounds in our amazing universe. And that's got to be the fundamental basis on which the debate occurs. And you would say that the overture to your dialogue partner, your interlocutor, is so you think the world is not really intelligent. It's just a bunch of chaos. It's meaningless. It has no purpose.
Well,
We're
yeah,
the specks in the universe.
I mean, the hypothetical interlocutor presumably would respond, yeah, it is. And the fact that you and I might feel otherwise is a consequence of, you know, evolutionary psychology, or, you know, maybe
So
they
there's-
think we're all insane or something.
So there's nothing objective about human dignity.
Well, that would be what the interlocutor would reply with, yeah.
And so sooner or later, the person either has to say it's all chaos, it's all meaningless.
Yeah.
And then I think the response is you're worth more than that. Or if they respond that there is a human dignity, then that string has to be pulled. And where does it come from?
I can only,
How is it violent?
I can only go off of personal experience, but when I've had this argument, yeah, the interlocutor usually bites the bullet and says, yeah, it is all chaos. I have no intrinsic worth. Neither do you and I. I'm only treating you nicely because it makes me feel nice to treat you nicely.
And do you think that that person will end up alienated empty.
Yeah, absolutely, but that doesn't, that's not exactly a convincing argument.
But you're not gonna, you are right that they have already bitten the bullet. They will not be convinced. But you can offer them
They're
a
like talking in
path.
the magazine at that point.
You can offer them a path on which more meaning can be found. And in their silent thoughts, they will reconsider taking that path.
I just don't see how that's actually like that's certainly an excellent rhetorical avenue. I don't see how that's actually like an argument though.
Oh, I think we might have talked about this after one of the previous sessions.
Yeah, we
About
did.
the possibility of proving first principles.
Yeah.
Because that's basically what we were talking about, like when an argument or, yeah, a discussion with an interlocutor gets to the point of like, is there meaning to existence or is there not? You can't demonstrate, like, properly speaking, syllogistically, like that meaning either exists or it doesn't exist. Like you have to basically be able to point in a certain sense rhetorically to forms that exist, because when it comes to the first principles of being, you can't prove them. Your mind, we who are realists, who are essentialists, would assert that these things are per se nota. They're known through themselves. Because if being really is real, then it really is intelligible. And if I have an intellect, which is like an intelligibility super upper, then when I perceive intelligibility, like I'm gonna grasp it. And so when you're basically, I mean,
That's what the intellect does. It falls
It just-
first upon being.
and it just soups it up.
And it also says what being is. So for your friend who thinks we're all chaos, he or she can say that's a tree. And to say that's a tree is already to fall upon the being, extract its form, and know that's treeness incarnate.
So what you basically, it's analogous to trying to prove to someone the mysteries of faith.
Yeah.
You can't prove them because those are principles which are given by not the light of the natural intellect, but the light of the divine light of faith coming upon the mind and giving it access to divine things. And in both cases, when you're trying to lead someone to faith, or when you're trying to, in this case, just lead someone to perceive what's real, you have to use a kind of apologetics. So there's apologetics of faith where you're arguing for the integrity of scripture or something. And there's the apologetics of reason where you're kind of doing the sort of things mentioned in this conversation. Like, don't you see that seems to have some form, that your claim that there's no meaning at all seems to be a universal claim, but you don't seem to believe that universal claims are possible. And then they come to realize that maybe, but at least what you're pointing to is that there is complete illogic in their first principles.
Yeah, 100%.
And then
nihilism.
Yeah,
basically.
nihilism.
Yes, that is exactly.
And
what I
all
was
you can
referring
do is
Nobody-
basically,
Nobody wants to be a
That's
nihilist.
You
might think,
I don't-
that this is it, we all see happiness.
This is another argument.
We
you
all
and I
see
had,
happiness,
actually.
and the question is, anybody really gonna be happy being a nihilist? You could say, well, Nietzsche may have been a happy nihilist, but I think he ended his life pretty sad.
Yeah.
But the point ultimately, I think, is to offer people a better way. And I think the way we will change our culture is, in a sense, the way John Paul II had a huge impact on our culture. By telling us that we were made for something greater. It's like the Navy's commercial, be all that you can be. This is the whole idea of actin potency. We have a lot of potential, which anybody would say. Who was going to say that the athlete who leaves incredible athletic potential on the table has done a good thing? What a shame, it's said, when the athlete doesn't perform up to potential. We should be all that we can be. John Paul II, go out into the deep. Experience the adventure of life. Reach for the heights. Experience the joy and the excitement of the universal truth. Gee, you can say it. And they'll say, oh, please. And they'll walk away. And then when they're walking home, they'll say, okay.
maybe.
I'm not convinced. I'm sorry.
That's
Like,
okay.
and like we can move on at this point, but
Okay.
like.
Well, we're out of time. But there's the 2 points that I wanted to raise. The
taking
2
a little
points that I wanted to raise were, why are we doing this in a law school? And the answer is to realize what a law is. It's a rational ordinance to an end, so it's teleological. And and law is analogical in the world of reality. And if the positivists in every law school in America are not willing to accept that, somebody has got to lead the way and say it out loud. And as you do say it out loud, it's a good idea just to sort of spoof up on the background so that you can put two sentences together and explain what you mean by there being different kinds of law, and recognize that anything that is not a positive law really does depend on reality being intelligent. And that the ordinance is meant to direct us to an objective good that really exists, which would be no surprise to our founders. I mean, the historical argument is not the lead argument, but it is a argument. In a world of positivists, it helps with credibility. It's sort of an evidence of credibility. It's that if all these people whom we really honor had these views, they couldn't all be crazy. If these views informed the founding documents, which we, basically worship, then why don't we pull those values and moral ideas out of them and give them new life?
Kind of apologetics for natural law.
Yes.
Using historical.
Yeah. Okay, we're beyond 1:30. We have a Zoom participant. And we're going to close out the Zoom, but thank you for participating.